Okay.
Hi, Michael.
Hello, Will.
How are you today?
Oh, reasonably good. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Welcome to Free Will on Blogging Heads TV. I am Will Wilkinson with the Cato Institute, residing in lovely Iowa City, Iowa. And you are Michael Berube, is that how you say it?
That's it.
That's it. A professor of, literature at Penn State University?
I also now co-direct a disability studies program. So my title just keeps getting longer. That's in the Science, Technology, and Society program. So the title is now it goes right around the edge of the desk.
The bigger your title gets, obviously, the more important you are.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No question.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not very important. I'm just a research fellow. That's pretty lame. What's on people's minds, Michael? What should we talk about?
I don't know. Anything going on in the world lately? Historic election of some kind?
Actually, this was a pretty funny thing I heard yesterday, which might amuse some of you. I was walking down the street in downtown Iowa City, and there's not a large African American population here in Iowa City, but there is one, and there were two 20-something black guys walking down the street together, and I was just walking to an ATM, and I overhear their conversation, and one of them said, "Hey, did you hear that Barack Obama won?" And the other guy, just completely uninterested, was like, "Oh, yeah." Which was somehow refreshing. I don't know why that was refreshing, but it was surprising. But Barack Obama,
one of the only blasé people.
Yeah, probably the only blasé people. Iowans are proud about Barack Obama's victory,
having launched him.
We feel like we had something to do with it, so I think there's a sense of a mild sense of ownership. Which may or may not be.
Now you, Illinois, Columbia, Hawaii, all these places now claim him as favorite son.
That's right. He's a lot of people's favorites. What's the climate up in State College?
Well, I waited almost 2 hours to vote. The turnout of students seemed to be amazing. I didn't really see anything like this. I haven't seen anything like this since 1992. But for all that, the numbers, let's say, in Center County weren't utterly overwhelming. It was sort of, I think, 39,000 to 31,000 for Obama. And a couple of neighboring counties. These are counties that I think have been made famous for clinging in guns and so forth. And Obama won a couple of them, too. So it wasn't quite the classic T of James Carville's, where Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in between. But there were still vast stretches where it was pretty much 2-1 McCain. But yeah, people around here seem pretty excited.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting thing. I think. It's just exciting. I wrote a blog post where and I cry at everything, but seeing at the
I read that.
Party or at the big gathering in Grant Park, seeing. Jesse Jackson just overwhelmed with emotion, completely overwhelmed me with emotion, and all of the news channels. Once the final projection came in, they sort of all turned the table over to their African American commentators, and it was just kind of amazing, like almost to a person. You could see. The commentators like Eugene Robinson.
I remember Eugene Robinson.
Just like he was like just choking back emotion, and just seeing that, even extremely successful black people having the sense that some barrier had lifted I just found it incredibly. I'm getting kind of moved by talking about it.
No, it was that relay of emotion. I mean, I was the minute Ohio was called, I felt that it was in the bag, but I didn't even. I had stopped thinking for the longest time, as much as one can, that Obama was black. I was so concerned about the 50-state strategy, about extending the Democratic Party further into the South and the new Southwest, that it wasn't really until 10, 11 o'clock I thought, oh no, there was this historic premise here that I didn't an event I did not think I would see in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's still sinking in. I mean, I think it's temporary. I don't know about for you. I did see, you had some caveats in your blog post, and they correspond pretty closely to mine. That on the one hand, I'm ambivalent. On the one hand, this is a victory, not like anything for a Democrat. I was too young for LBJ. Carter and Clinton didn't have this kind of euphoria to them, and they almost both lost it at the last second anyway. So there's that sort of leftover euphoria. On the other hand, there's the very sobering, all kinds of thought that this is a terrible, terrible mess we're in, domestically, internationally, and it'll take more than hope and change and really good campaign graphics to dig ourselves out of this one.
Yeah. He's coming into an unenviable position, and people with with hope of a really sweeping, more social democratic mandate are just bound to be disappointed. The constraints on even a unified democratic government are extremely daunting at this point. There's no money to spend, really, after the war and after the bailout, and we're having a recession, so tax revenues are going to be down. So there's going to be a lot of really difficult prioritizing to go on, and that's a recipe for sort of intra-coalition fighting, because people are going to have, within the Democratic Party, you're going to have very different priorities.
Part of the pushback I hear already, right, is that he's going to have to stand up to those, really terrible, the real socialists, in Congress. And while I don't think that's true, I do think you're right that there isn't enough money. We have to make more money to have all of Obama's campaign promises and programs actually work out. But I also have to admit, coming from where I do on the campus, I'm at least within shouting distance of that wing of the left that is constitutionally disappointed. They were disappointed, in FDR's first term also. So, disappointment will be the order of the day, and I think we ought to just take that in stride as just, standard operating procedure.
Yeah. Well, did you see the clip of Ralph Nader on Fox News?
Oh my God! Yes, I did. It's not often I just go to ZOMG kind of discourse in real life as opposed to on blogs. But that was jaw dropping, and Shepard Smith's reaction, I think, said it all. But I think Nader is so past his sell-by date by now that I feel almost nothing but tenderness and pity.
Yeah, we'll throw a link up on the side for those who didn't see it. But Nader, his point was that and it's a point that he's been making forever, that the Republicans and the Democrats. It's a point that I actually tend to agree with in broad outlines, that the Democrats and the Republicans are a sort of unified corporatist front who basically conspire together to provide corporate welfare for well-connected lobbyists and so on and so forth. And he was challenging Barack Obama to do more than that, to be a real more like a socialist, really, sort of redistributivist. But he a very, very inartfully chosen term for whether Barack Obama was going to be sort of complicit in the corporatist party structure, and God, just cringe-worthy.
Right. Well, yeah. Once he got away from the actual term, Uncle Tom. The critique of Obama's sort of corporate democratism was the standard critique. And I'm not surprised there'd be some overlap with the libertarian critique. Of course, this would take us into that conversation about what libertarians and liberals on the left have to say to each other. But, again, I came out of that wing of the left that said, Democrats, the second party of capital. That's right. There isn't a party that's actually anti-capitalist, despite what Joe the Plumber thinks. So I think a lot of that critique is reasonably cogent, and I also think that Obama probably will be disappointing on that front. I'm fully prepared for that. I think McCain-Palin would have been a disaster of biblical proportions.
Yeah, I did a commentary for Marketplace, chiding the McCain people for the spread the wealth around stuff, because I didn't see John McCain arguing for a head tax or something.
Right,
I mean, like he's not gonna touch the overall extremely progressive structure of American taxation. The question when it comes to contemporary democratic politics is whose money is going to be taken away, how much of it, and who's going to get it, right? And there's no non-redistributive democratic politics. That's a problem that I have with democratic politics. But if that's the game you're playing, it's just sort of disingenuous to act like you're not spreading the wealth around. It's just when you start a lot of wars, it's just a different set of people who gets that wealth. If you cut taxes, whatever, there's going to be some distributive consequences to whoever's set of policies.
Right.
And
no
no
non-distributive politics in the room. Yes.
Yeah, and so people should just be more upfront about. Here's a question about how we want the distribution to go, who we want to benefit, who we want to ding with the tax structure. Go ahead.
I thought it was incoherent all around. I mean, it was lovely to hear Sarah Palin talk about fully funding the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's incredibly expensive. And it's about the most redistributionist thing. Well, not the most, but it's in the top 10. So to hear that at the same time, there's talk of a spending freeze. I just think most of both campaigns are reasonably incoherent with regard to economic policy. But I do trust Obama on this more.
Before we move on, I want to talk a little bit more about the cultural meaning of Obama's victory, related to this question about whether he's going to be very radical. And last night, when I was laying awake in bed, I was thinking about a very good essay that I read in this sort of new right-wing sort of version of Slate, Cultural Leaven, by Daniel Larison, who writes for the American Conservative, and Larison is more or less a sort of kind of isolationist paleocon. And his big issue is foreign policy, and he was very rightly emphasizing that Obama's stated views from a long way back are just very, very, very similar to the status quo foreign policy establishment. He was against the Iraq War in particular and wants to withdraw troops, but he doesn't actually present much less of a hawkish stance than McCain even would, given his own statement. You saw his performance in the debates, and one of the reasons why he did seem to do so well was because he did seem so aggressive about rooting out Al Qaeda out of
going into Pakistan. That was a double conditional clause, but it was mystifying to me that McCain placed so much emphasis on that. Like, you don't do that, you don't tip your hand, and it allowed. Actually, not that I was alive at the time, it reminded me of Kennedy running to Nixon's right on communism. That in fact, Nixon and Eisenhower had been asleep at the switch, and that Obama at least would present the possibility of going in and violating Pakistani sovereignty if we knew where he was and there were no aid coming from Pakistan. Very strange moment.
Yeah, well, so I thought Daniel was very quite cogent in his argument that Obama is sincerely not really much of a move to a more dovish foreign policy, but this was part of a more general analysis in which Larison mentioned that Obama's success has to do with his incredibly conservative approach to institutions. But the reason that he was able to succeed so well in just these dominant cultural institutions like Harvard Law School and the University of Chicago School of Law, it was because he is so conciliatory, because he doesn't rock the boat, because he completely accepts the status quo terms on which the debate is being conducted. And his viability as a presidential candidate had very much to do with this, that he did not indicate any interest in shaking up the priorities of the Democratic Party in a fundamentally different approach to things. He is, in fact, in some sense, represents an almost sort of like platonic manifestation of a kind of liberal institutionalism.
I wonder, I hear you, although the caveat there I would have is that I think, again, from the left, the critique is that Obama will just be a better manager of the empire. He's not going to close U.S. bases around the world. That's probably a fair bet, a safe bet to make. But there was this moment, and I wondered whether Samantha Power's presence, for as long as she was on his team of advisors, and I expect to see her reappear somewhere or other in the cabinet.
And she was still coaching him for the debates, so I mean.
Oh yeah, no, and the fact that he would mention the fact that he would mention the word genocide in a campaign speech, the fact that he spoke when he spoke at Penn State, he spoke of restoring habeas corpus. First time I've heard habeas corpus in a campaign speech, and closing Guantanamo, which made the couple of college Republicans in front of me just gasp and then clutch their pearls. Those I thought were good moves, and they signaled a sense, at least for this is where I am on foreign policy, that there was a moment there after Kosovo, after Sierra Leone, after East Timor, of a liberal internationalism, where the international community would never let Rwanda happen again. Now, exactly how to go about these so-called humanitarian interventions and how to avoid war in the name of humanitarian intervention is a whole another question. But I think at least Obama would ask it. That's my hope on the foreign policy front, that it would still be a sort of managerial and, as you say, a conservative approach to institutions. But what I like about, or at least what's promising on that front, is that some of those institutions, like the International Criminal Court, are still too young to be very conservative about. They still have to be shored up. And again, from where I stand, the extradition of Pinochet was a good day. The intervention in Sierra Leone was a good thing, and that moment seems to have been obliterated by Iraq. I don't know whether we can get back to it.
Well, I think you're right. I agree with you about most of that. But the more general point then that I think I'm driving at is I do think Obama, especially in foreign policy, represents progress on the margin. He's been criticized for his stance on FISA.
Right.
There's actually fairly good evidence that he's not going to be a civil libertarian's dream on drawing back executive power. But the thing that I'm thinking of is like he was able to succeed and able to win by being so establishment and playing the game. He was such a virtuoso at playing the game according to the pre-existing rules of the game. That then, what does that say about the lifting of these structural barriers to the progress of African Americans?
That's a good question.
That in some sense, what it says is that if you're the sort of like ultimate conformist who can outplay the establishment players at their own game, then you can reach the commanding heights. But it doesn't seem that the message doesn't seem to be that it's not necessarily a bright new day for people who are still in terrible public schools and will never have the level of education necessary to really fully take part in the system. I wonder how significant the message will be in the long run, given what the strategy that he had to undertake to get there.
That's, like I say, great question. But again, to push back a little on it, it wasn't plausible, at least to me, that the first black president was going to be Cornel West or Angela Davis. Right? So it's going to be a more or less mainstream. It's going to be a more or less mainstream figure, or someone, as in Biden's immortal words, the first, clean, articulate figure. I'm sure he still regrets that one. But I have to say, I thought, as did some, mainstream media watchers, that the first really successful black candidate on this level will be much more in the Doug Wilder mode. That, in fact, Obama seems to be a bit left in some ways of what I thought, with the kind of conformism I thought it would take to get this far. And, the FISA vote aside, and that one it still sticks in my craw. I've not gotten over that one. But there's astonishingly little under-the-bus throwing in Obama's campaign. There was no Sister Soldier moment. There was no moment on going back on gay rights. So I'm a little more encouraged on that front, I think, than you are. Yeah, it doesn't. You don't get through Harvard, being head of Harvard Law Review and University of Chicago by being a real firebrand. But I think he's got this really interesting mix of tremendously charismatic force of personality and very sort of institutional, as you say, conservative or conservative. I don't think it's a liberal and conservative thing. It's conservative in the institutional sense, I suppose.
Yeah.
But there's something else going on there as well, and I think it goes back to the question of the youth vote. When Obama would say, there's no other country in the world in which my story is even possible, well, his story is a story of sort of postgraduate professional success. Mm-hmm. And this goes to a point that you made on your blog about the fact that, astonishingly enough, above a certain income level, I think, what was it, 110,000? Mm-hmm. Voters were breaking Democratic. Mm-hmm. And if you go by education level, not that everyone with a PhD is making 110 and above, of course, right, but professionals broke overwhelmingly for Obama. There's a real sort of identification, I think, among the sort of, young urban professional, or now, as I say, middle-aged, like me, no longer urban professional class, that says, no, Obama is one of us. The future does not lie, with a McCain-Palin kind of demographic. It lies instead with the sort of... And I was joking earlier about Obama's cosmopolitanness, but I think that's part of it. He is sort of rootless cosmopolitan, successful professional, and that's appealing to to people of like mind and background.
Yeah, that's one of the incredible pieces of data in Andrew Gelman's book, Rich State, Poor State, Red State, Blue State. I might be getting those, red, blue, rich, poor. I don't know which way it goes. But over time, the changing composition, the changing party sympathies of different kinds of wealthy people. One of the big break is between wealthy people who are religious and wealthy people who aren't. That's the big break, right? Like, and there's a trend. If there's an overall cultural trend towards secularization, a higher proportion of the wealthy population will be secular, and those people are overwhelmingly liberal. But another breakdown within somewhat wealthy voters is the breakdown between professionals, in the sense of people who have to go through a bunch of education and certification processes. So lawyers, doctors, accountants. Right. So there's these sort of white collar professions. That whole set of people has been trending extremely strongly Democratic. The group that's been going the other way are like entrepreneurs, small business owners, and to some extent managers of firms. And so it's interesting that you're actually seeing this sort of this split in sympathies within the upper middle and lower upper classes in their ideological sympathies. And I think that's sort of fascinating. I think you're exactly right. Obama is, like I said before, kind of like a platonic example of just dominating virtuoso success in the institutions of sort of American professional mobility. That you can get into college, you get into grad school, you go clerk for a judge or whatever it is that you do, and he's played that system as well as anybody possibly could. And I do think that people who have been along that track see him as having a kind of special competence that they admire and part of a culture that they identify with. Yeah,
I think I'll just add two quick things to that. I think Michael Lind had something on this in book 13 so years ago, Next American Nation, the professions you're talking about, law, medicine, academe, accountancy, these are places relatively insulated from globalization. Very high, licensing requirements, and very low possibility that their jobs will be shipped overseas. So there's that. There's one thing about Obama's time. I want to give him a little more credit for negotiating the turbid waters at Harvard, because when he got there, it wasn't an easy time to be first black editor of Harvard Law Review. And I know there's also a lot of pressure of him to appoint more black folks to the Law Review, which he did not. He disappointed some people on those grounds. But I can't say that I would have been anywhere nearly, or anyone I know would have been as nearly as politically talented to negotiate. I mean, there was on the one, Derek Bell. There were no tenured black women faculty. It was not a happy time in the history of race relations at Harvard. Particularly in the law school in the late 80s. So it's not just a question of sailing smoothly through without ruffling any feathers. He's got to be, he had to have some really admirable political skills even then. But one upshot of that, this whole sort of, story of professionalism and clambering into the upper middle class through academic success, it's what left open the charge, which I found very strange during the primaries, that he was a limousine liberal, and that Hillary, of all people, Hillary was remade suddenly into Eugene V. Debs. All of a sudden, she was the candidate of the working class. Again, very strange moment. And I'm still.
She was the well-to-do young Republican, and and he was the
he was from a single family, single-parent family,
a school teacher and an African immigrant. Yeah, it's just so weird how those narratives can emerge. In American politics, it is really, really weird. Even when in the fact that McCain would try to sort of move to, the populist side of Obama is also weird. I mean, this guy is just, third generation, military aristocracy, or third, fourth, fifth. I don't know how many generations, but
since the founding of the Marines, yes.
Yeah. Like
I know he's in the Navy, but
It's a very strange thing that and I think some people did. I mean, a lot of people did give him credit, but like the conservative commentators tend not to like to give credit to from your own bootstrap success stories that involve the liberal institutions that they don't like.
Right.
So they'll be really celebratory of a small businessman who, a guy who scrimps and saves and gets together a small business and makes it bigger and then runs for Congress. That guy is a man of the people, but a guy who gets his scholarship,
did well on his LSATs, right?
Yeah, and goes into an elite institution and then just stays in those elite institutions has somehow given up any sort of by your bootstraps cred.
Right. And as well as having no executive experience, yes.
Yeah.
But I think one of the reasons... Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, one of the reasons I think one of the things that confused that narrative, I think, was the selection of Palin, because the bloodletting on the right is going to be very interesting over the next couple of weeks, and I'm going to make popcorn and watch, because I thought it wasn't just the need to shore up the base. When you've got an argument, like I have foreign policy experience because my state is near Russia, you're really actually challenging the cogency of argument itself. If you're trying to get away with that sort of thing in the public sphere, and a lot of conservative intellectuals weren't biting. It wasn't just Colin Powell and his endorsement. I mean, there were a number of people who said, "Look, I'm not going to the mat for this one. This is just an insult to intelligence across the board. I don't care what party it's from." And I think that taunting of intellectuals, pointy heads, people who take such things seriously, it can only go so far. I mean, it really at a point alienates the whole David Brooks. I don't know if David Brooks is much of a wing, but David Brooks, Kathleen Parker, and the people who actually took a deep breath and said, this is. I'm too identified with certain liberal elite institutions to try to swallow this one. So that has yet to be thrashed out.
It was a smaller scale. I mean, both the revolt wasn't as comprehensive, but it's a much bigger sort of issue. So you remember when Harriet Miers was nominated.
Right, right.
There's a whole sort of strata of elite conservative academics and elite conservative judges and people who work in the Department of Justice, and they just created a uniform wall and just said, no way, she is not one of us, right? And it was really interesting to see how there was that veto. Yeah.
It's like they save all the real intellectual firepower for the judiciary, where in some ways, nothing else matters. And the same people who turned and fired on Harriet Miers. What amazed me is that even all the way down into the right-wing blogosphere, all the way down to Michelle Monk, and no one was on board with Harriet Miers, but Sarah Palin divided them. It's very different attitudes toward the judiciary and executive.
That is really interesting. I think there's more of a, with the judiciary, like if you don't get her, you're going to get somebody better. That was the idea, right? Like the idea here was that if you attack the candidate, the vice presidential candidate for our team, then you just screw up the chances of our team winning. And so it's not like you were going to get a better one. So what was the point of it, right?
It was also, you're right, a structural insult to the entire Federalist Society. What do we have this farm team for, right? If not for the cultivation of first-rate conservative jurists. So completely different story on that front.
Yeah, the conservative movement has spent a lot of time building those institutions, and that's one of the reasons why there was such an outcry that there really is a structure of elite conservative legal scholarship that is truly impressive, truly scholarly, truly accomplished. It's been built over decades to be a force, and when Bush just went around it, it was just like, no, this won't do. And I was delighted to see that because I like that kind of elitism. And
I have to say, I think it's preferable to the alternative myself too.
Yeah, but I wanted to talk a little bit about more about the student vote. So one of the big stories of this election was that there was a huge swing in support for the Democratic candidate among the 18 to 29-year-old demographic. What was it, like 12 or 13% swing from the 2004 election? There was the turnout wasn't actually that significantly higher than the last election. I think it was just 1% higher, but
a little higher than that. It didn't break 1972's record, though. No.
But the Obama's dominance in that demographic was very, very impressive. So what do you think explains that, Michael? Are you being successful at brainwashing your students at Penn State to...
Not so much my students. I think it's my book. My book did it. My book came out in 2006. Democrats took back the House, and it took a little while for the book to steamroll and finally persuade people to take back the executive. In all seriousness, I think a lot of it has to be... what about the McCain campaign was appealing to young people? Bush, especially after 9/11, still had a version of calling people to a sense of national purpose and national service. So I think you're seeing a little bit more of a split vote back then. And then, of course, some of those people crept up into that 30 to 44 demographic, which was much more evenly split. This time, I don't think it was really too much the impact of the campuses. I'd like to believe it. But I think an exceptionally bankrupt campaign from the Republican side in terms of what it had to tell people under 30. Proposition 8 aside, and I think that really was an anomaly back over in California, I just don't see the culture wars issues galvanizing people under 30. It's very hard to get them to care that people down the street are gay and want to marry. They just don't see it as a threat. Immigration didn't play much of a factor. Wasn't much of a factor in this election. I'm not sure that it would have driven the youth vote any higher into the Republican camp. So I really think it's. I mean, as much as when we exchanged emails earlier today, I noted, because I think your point about secularization is not only right but interesting. So it's a twofer. But there's some evidence that as students spend their 4 or 5 or 6 or however many years on campus, they They go less often to traditional religious services. They don't necessarily lose their religion. The Templeton Foundation, the UCLA study says they're becoming more spiritual instead. But the point is that
I'm not religious. Isn't that the sort of thing you say to a girl in a bar?
Sorry?
I'm spiritual, not religious.
Right. Yes, there's a spirit somewhere. It breathes through all of us. Right? It's like the what's that online thing? The Unitarian Jihad, right? The spirit of ecumenical anything. Mm-hmm. But I think it is the case. And I was just talking about this at a couple small liberal arts colleges where students there take the whole idea of going to a small liberal arts college very seriously. Mm-hmm. And they're asking not just what's the point. I mean, I think I'm trying to distill down what I think the point is from the rather chatty answer in that book to a sort of good liberal arts education just gives you more tools in the conceptual toolbox. People who want me to say, no, it makes you more empathetic. Not necessarily. Does it make you more liberal? I don't see that necessarily follows either, but it does give you at least a little more cosmopolitan sense of how other people have lived, do live, what other kinds of options for thinking and for living are possible, and that in itself can be secularizing and unsettling. And if it translates, I just don't see that it translates immediately in this sort of 4-year swing to the Democrats. But I do think that this longer-term demographic trend of a sort of increasing secularization, increasing cosmopolitanism, is liberalizing with a small L.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's fascinating that there is such a trend, and I do think it has to do with the. So there's an extent to which I think just getting a liberal arts education is liberalizing in this very sort of general psychological sense of becoming more open to pluralism, more cosmopolitan, as you say. The college campuses tend to be more cosmopolitan and diverse than their surrounding environment. So here at the University
of Iowa,
especially
around here,
yeah, or at Penn State, it's not.
You went to Northern Iowa, am I right?
I visited Northern Iowa. Yeah.
And I was there about 10 years ago, and it was just as they got their first coffee house. 'Cause I remember the faculty making a big thing of this. And we overheard two of the students complaining about this coffee house. It had all the liberal drinks, like the latte and the cappuccino. And one student complained to another and said, geez, we might as well be in Iowa City. And there's a really important point to be taken from this, which is, Anthony Appiah gave a talk here. It's the talk he's giving these days on cosmopolitanism, and a lot of people on the theory wing were disappointed that he was, first of all, even cosmopolitanism is a dirty word, to some of the left, because it's, too rootless, too citizen of the worldy. They think it's, basically the theory of the traveling class. But also, Appiah's response to all this, ranging from what kinds of animals people do and don't eat, to what kinds of marital practices they do and don't engage in, is that it really is a matter of demographics, of people moving down the street, and you find that their smelly food actually doesn't bother you, or, for that matter, their gay relationship doesn't bother you. And he was so resolutely empirical about this that it ticks some people off. And I wonder, in the end, whether he isn't right. Whether it isn't just a matter of more rootless cosmopolitans moving to some districts in North Carolina and gradually turning the state blue by the narrowest of margins over the course of about a 20, 30-year period.
Yeah, I think that here's one of the most bizarre factoids that I picked up in the research that I've been doing about inequality, which is that places, the regions in the United States that were the most heavily industrialized at the turn of the 20th century remain the most socially liberal places today. Why would that industrialization at the turn of the century have an effect on liberalization today? Well, it's those places at the turn of the century that attracted very large immigrant populations. And so when you mix populations of people from with different ethnic backgrounds, with different religious traditions, there's actually an incentive of the sort of economic structure to help these people get along so that they can be productive together. And those are the places that built an ethos of sort of like pluralistic tolerance that it appears there are like path dependencies that affect us today. So the industrial cities of of the early 20th century remain some of the most socially liberal and tolerant places. And I think that there's actually a profound insight in that, which is that the effect of the sort of free labor markets, for instance, that just allow people to go where economic opportunities are, create a mixing of people, which in turn creates just a tolerance for, you just get accustomed to diversity, and that kind of diversity creates a sense of contingency about your own commitments, and people sort of ease off of them after a while.
I've been watching what's happening in Ireland over the last 20 years. It's in my lifetime that divorce was illegal. The Quiet Revolution in Quebec predates me. But these are my peoples, right? The French Canadian on one side, on my father's side, and the Irish on the other. Very, very traditionally Catholic, very hardcore. Not just about abortion, but about divorce. And in each case, it took about 30 years, and usually the influx of good old turbocharged capitalism and the introduction of new ways of life. I'm not sure. I'm basically. I'm not doing justice to the story of Quebec, about which I wish I knew more. But I think that's sort of. Well, actually, this is what I was trying to write about when I was doing the part of my book that's about Willa Cather's My Antonia. Is that these various groups getting together on the prairie, you learn that actually some of their cultural practices, like the eating of these really it seemed dried mushrooms, not terribly dangerous to the Republic. Religious dispute about where to bury someone who's committed suicide, that's a bit more serious. And I've been I was using that book as a way of asking really what kinds of cultural practices do involve the intervention by the state and which don't, which is another point I would think of lively commerce and disagreement between libertarians and liberals on the left.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to go back for a second about the trend in students, because I just want to get your comment on it. So it's a stock talking point on the right that universities and colleges make students more liberal, and I know that a couple of authors on National Review's Corner blog discuss the issue of whether or not the swing towards Obama represents the success of liberals in foisting their views upon sort of unsuspecting rubes from the countryside. Do you think there's anything to that at all?
I bet, yeah. I think insofar as I wonder whether it happens though in the classroom, or whether it happens because of the fact that when you come to State College, nestled as we are in the middle of Appalachia, I mentioned this in the course of the book, as you know. I'm not sure it's necessarily the actual curricular content of liberalism so much as the fact that you run into people, you run into all the international students, you run into students of 18 different faiths, you can hear foreign languages spoken on the street in the middle of Pennsylvania, literally on a daily basis. That may do more in some ways to liberalize people than even my leftist reading of The Rise of Silas Lapham. So I'm not sure really that I'm not sure the indoctrination works. As I argued in the book, actually, there's some features of campus leftism that I think many students find repellent. And I keep warning, drive them into the arms of the libertarians and the college Republicans because they think leftism is largely about scolding people and taking away their cheeseburgers. So I'm not sure that it's the faculty is getting all this good work done. It may, like I say, Appia might be right. It just may be the demographics.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think there's also a lot to the idea that a lot of campus radicals just turn tons of kids off. Most of them aren't interested in that. I have to admit that in reading your book, you start with anecdotes about a student that you had. What was his name, Michael? Or no, you're Michael.
John, not his real name.
John. Yeah. I was John, more or less, in college.
I get a lot of people saying that. They all say they're Spartacus. I don't get it, but yeah. You were the counterweight?
I was like the crazy Ayn Rand fan in every class who would derail the discussion and push the, kind of basically demand that the professor address some point that he wasn't interested in addressing. I think I was like just a more affable guy than the
I'd hope so.
John in your book, but but I think there's definitely extent to which, I mean, so the extent to which I'm sympathetic to the conservative critique is the extent to which I genuinely experienced a sense of dismissiveness about what were quite good questions. I might have put them in a simplistic or naive way, and of course, we all grow up intellectually over time. But a lot of the points that I was trying to press are were just simpler versions of points that I would press now. And you do get a sense if you have a libertarian politics or sort of moral individualist sort of ethics that the statement of your point of view will be tolerated but not exactly welcomed.
That's like arguing twice. It was actually a guy I think who writes for The Economist who wrote to me, and that was his phrase. That in some of his classes, in order to make a reasonably free market libertarian kind of argument, he had to argue twice. Once to make his point, and then a sort of second meta argument to make the point that his point deserved to be heard. And that's
exactly.
That's what I talk about that moral mist. That's what you were. That's what you were experiencing there, Will. Was that dang moral mist? And if it gets to be foggy, then it's toxic.
Yeah, and it really is exhausting. And so I do think that there is a self-selection of a certain kind of person out of academia. I dropped out before I finished my dissertation, and it wasn't because of that at all. It was just because I was no longer interested in what I was studying. There was a lot of that exhaustion, and after a while, you don't want to have to argue everything twice. You don't have to argue with people whether or not you deserve to be argued with. So I think the main effect of that isn't that then the composition of the academy is such that the remaining professors have a sort of like hegemonic point of view. I mean, maybe that is the effect of it. Is that there's a lot of really sound, interesting points of view. There are lots of strands of the intellectual tradition that are more or less unrepresented.
In some disciplines. I mean, it depends. Are you in economics or no?
I studied political philosophy.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I was misremembering. Because I think, law and economics and feels like that. And I think a lot of the social sciences as well, there's more of a mix than there is. And as I complain and lament in the book, over in literature and especially in the arts, it's basically wall to wall one party.
Right.
And this is getting to be a running joke among the colleagues who get together over the past couple of weeks. So one of us has to pretend to be a McCain supporter just so we can, pretend to have one in the room. And that's not, I mean, to say that we're all Democrats, though, of course, doesn't suggest that we're a hegemonic bloc when it comes to the position of what role history should play in the interpretation of literature. But it does mean, and this is where I agree with you, it does mean that not only does it create the sort of moral mist and lead to a sort of self-selection, but it also can lead to some real intellectual laziness once a discipline gets, so univocal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
I mean, if whether it's your 19-year-old self or your current self, I mean, when you said that you probably didn't put some of your questions as well as you might now, I can't think of any one of us who would put questions or whose 19-year-old selves were quite as adept at Q&A as we.
Anybody who got worse.
I hope not. And no, it's a job to take those questions and make them better. And I've been especially that was the point of my book. The moment at which I went back over this one student, not John, the student who I believe told me what he thought he wanted me to hear about James Weldon Johnson's autobiography of an ex-colored man. He just basically thought I wanted him to say good things about black people, and I didn't catch that until after he wrote this email to me saying that he had gone to conservative coming out day. And I went back and thought, well, why would he want to say this to me? Does he think I've been, does he think he had something to prove in saying so? And then I realized that I'd really missed an opportunity to engage him more thoroughly throughout the semester. He obviously thought I was, just going to dismiss him if he said what he thought would be the wrong thing about this novel. Mm-hmm. And I don't know exactly what to do about students who come in, assuming that. especially if they're timorous at all, unlike you, are doing themselves and me and no favors, and I'm doing them no favors.
Yeah. Well, I remember having an assumption that wasn't actually. So it was partly confirmed by my experience, but there was an extra element to it that I really did just assume a certain level of hostility to my views, and underestimated the extent to which my professors were really willing to listen and to engage. And so there's this weird sort of mutuality to the problem, because on the one hand you are getting the moral mist, and you are. And a whole class will, a sigh of disapproval, or will sort of like...
or the eye rolling, yes.
Yeah, will fall over you if you bring up something. So there is that really is sort of discouraging the voicing of a particular point of view. But at the same time, there's the tendency of a lot of both conservative students and more sort of libertarian students. A lot of them have an assumption of antagonism that causes them to... put their point in an antagonistic way, and that's a lot of what I had to learn when I was going through graduate school. Is that like really, if I learned how to say what I wanted to say in terms that people would understand, people would be very receptive to talking about it, as opposed to just this assumption that if I tried to make this point, they would try to drum me out of the room. I don't know what to do about that either, because there seems to be sort of a mutual misunderstanding.
Well, I meant seriously the part of the book where I said, it would take the women's movement as an inspiration. I mean, now granted, there were institutional attempts to recruit women to faculty and as students, but I can't believe, except in some cases, and again, a student just buttonholed me about this at a campus I was visiting and said, look, I'm the lone libertarian in the film department. And I deal with some people who really, just get in my face and hostile in ways that are completely inappropriate. And so no, it's not. And then also, the same reason I worry that some forms of campus leftism are driving people away. Well, of course, these are the students who would come to speak to me about such a thing, right? So there's some self-selection there as well. But I was serious about the idea of not only wanting more conservative libertarian colleagues around to argue with, but they would have to run this sort of moral mist gauntlet for a while, but it can't be as bad as what women dealt with 35, 40 years ago. And there's a recent, I thought, quite moving essay in the Education Life New York Times last Sunday, of a woman they'd invited a writer to campus, and he was a throwback to the day when when people saw women in the academy basically as possible sex partners and not much else. And that took another good generation to change, and I'm sure that and the women who came out of that were exhausted. I've spoken to a lot of them. It was part of the Hillary Obama phenomenon in my wing. It had to do with the women who dealt with just decades of nonsense sexism, and for them, their level of identification with Hillary was so intense, I couldn't even begin to fathom it. It wasn't just identity politics. It was something deeper than that. So what I find, and I especially find this in the graduate level, graduate students in English have come to talk to me about this as well. And usually, the people who said, "Look, I feel like there's no place here for me as a Christian." Well, as a matter of fact, most of English literature is written by Christians. You would think, that. I don't know, maybe something in the early periods.
But you're not working with any, in the same way, right?
I know. None of your colleagues. Which is actually, again, to go back to that, one of the places I visited September, was Belmont, tiny Belmont, which is where the second presidential debate was held. Small Christian college. And even there, even though the faculty know perfectly well, they actually, sign the agreement when they arrive, basically placing the statutory limits on their academic freedom, perfectly acceptable to the AUP as long as it's in writing. Even there, not a whole lot of believers over in the literature and arts faculty, and that's partly because you've nationalized the faculty. They're not just hiring folks from regional southern schools any longer. They're hiring in these national searches, and once again, the rootless cosmopolitans are showing up. But anyway, that's back to the demographics. I agree. I mean, the classroom demeanor. I think you're touching on a mess of things at once. Actually, the classroom demeanor is one thing. The demeanor of the professorial demeanor. Then there's the demeanor of your fellow students, which is part of what my student John was dealing with. I mean, he actually built up such a level of antagonism that he thought the other 16 people were arrayed against him, and even though many of them actually shared his political commitments. And then you've got the campus climate in general, and that's where all the things that happen extramurally that professors like me usually wind up only reading about in the school paper. That's a whole other phenomenon unto itself. And that's, I think, that's the area where the really worst PC stuff has happened over the last 20 years, both in terms of the excesses of the people who themselves PC and in terms of the backlash.
Yeah, the one thing that's always baffled me, where I think universities could do a lot better, I mean, like, this is a long way from, the Horowitz sort of like student bill of rights sort of thing, like just campus-funded lecture series could do a lot better in terms of having a broader array of points of view represented, and I think just like small things like that can help some students feel more at home on the campus. That if there's one person that year who shows up who thinks something that's very close to what they think, that means something. You don't feel completely isolated.
Right. I wonder also whether, I mean, there's so many, a place like Penn State, I think Iowa's fairly similar. There are usually about 3 or 4 lectures a day, invited speakers. I exaggerate only slightly. It's only the really high-profile ones, the ones that are funded by student government, say, the ones that give you Ann Coulter or Camille Paglia or Michael Moore or whatever, that draw this kind of attention. And I wish undergraduates knew more. I wish also we did a better job of advertising to undergraduates all these, I think, much more substantive and interesting talks that are dedicated to a specific topic. Say, the conflict between religion and science, the history of nationalism. These kinds of things that I think most undergraduates think they're not for them. They're too dry and scholarly. And I think a lot of people actually who go in and deliver those things assume there's going to be no undergraduates in the room. And I've just been thinking this lately because not that my own lectures are all that well attended, but the last couple dozen or so have had a good smattering of undergraduates. And because I'm not in the the Horowitz and Coulter mode, nor am I really trying to be their counterpart. I think those forms of lectures turn out to be fairly, and it's not just mine. I mean, the undergraduates who've gone to mine have gone to everything in the series that I'm in. And I think those sort of intermediate series would be much preferable to the sort of, what should we call them? The mega lectures, the celebrity lectures. But that, and then there's the whole question of how to, and this is way beyond me, to deal with various student groups when they clash. We had a thing here a couple of years ago where the college Republicans had, it was going around the country catching the illegal immigrant day. And of course, not only was this nonsense in and of itself, but it allowed everyone opposed to it say, no, we should be tolerant, and it actually foreclosed any kind of recognition that the parties have been divided on immigration for quite some time. There are at least 2 camps on immigration, Republicans, at least 2 in Democrats. You hardly hear any of the sort of labor protectionist wing of the Democrats any longer, but it's still there. So, I know, I'm just a long way of agreeing with you.
Well, I think the last thing that I want to bring up, we're running short in our time, is that, well, first of all, let me say something more about moral mist. And you are, I think, exactly right that if people with my politics want to have more of a voice in academia, then they just have to earn it. Right, I mean, it's just you just have to do the slog. You have to get the job. You have to publish the papers. You have to get the reputation. You just have to, there's not a shortcut to that, and there's really not a concerted cabal that's out to stop you. It's extra effort. And one of the things that one of the big changes in my own beliefs over the last, maybe 5-10 years is sort of accepting feminist critiques or just basic sociological critiques about the structural nature of discrimination and social stratification, that it doesn't need to be coercive, that it can be that you can actually have just like a fairly loosely knit set of social expectations that can really hold people back, and that kind of insight is exactly what allows you to appreciate how important Barack Obama's victory is. It also is the thing that helps you appreciate that that free market types or conservative types aren't just whining about academia being
I'm only laughing
being
because
a little bit harder for them.
No kidding. I give you a parallel thing though, because one of the great questions I got in the course of this, it was at Belmont because they were having the debate. The whole year was devoted to debate and dissent and dialogue, and so I hold out my argument from what's liberal about. Well, even if I can't change your mind about X, what would I have to do? What counts as changing your mind in your belief system, your culture? So someone came right back to me and said, "Can you give me an example of something you've changed your mind about?" I gave a couple of examples, but I forgot one of the ones that came about precisely from reading people not sharing my political persuasion on things. Had to do with affirmative action. It had to do with, not that I'm against it, but I didn't go that far. But I remember in 1991, Congress was trying to pass the Civil Rights Bill, and the right was decrying it as a quota bill. Well, the substantive issue at stake had to do with disparate impact theory from Duke Power versus Griggs, or whatever it was, in 71, and apparently struck down on Ward's Code via Tonio. And of course, at the time, I just said, you got to restore disparate impact theory because, again, picking up your point, you can have these structural things that are not the work of a cabal, but that cumulatively have a disparate impact that is discriminatory. And I never took seriously employers who said, yeah, but I don't know which things have a disparate impact. And so to cover myself, I'm just going to hire X number of people so as to avoid a lawsuit. And I have, not that I've come completely around this, but I realized these people weren't lying. Disparate impact theory, I think, it's right, but it's hard to put into institutional practice. And not every kind of thing that has a disparate impact is the classic SAT question that never existed. Regatta is to yacht as, rabbit is to something else. Disparate impact things can be much more diffuse. And sure, I can see employers resorting to a crude quota system in order to avoid suit. And I would never have even entertained that. I would have just dismissed it. The rest of my life, had I not read a little more widely and a little more cosmopolitanly about the history of affirmative action. And one of these, I'm going to forget the name of the book, Pursuit of Fairness, Terry Anderson. I think it's exceptionally good. In fact, I even got a nice little shout-out from Nick Gillespie over at Reason Magazine for writing a fair review of Terry Anderson's book, In the Nation. And Terry Anderson's book itself, I think, eminently fair history of affirmative action. But this isn't just a sort of I want more colleagues down the hall to argue with. I actually want these perspectives again give me more conceptual tools in the toolbox and help me see how other people sincerely disagree with me for reasons that weren't clear to me when I started out.
Yeah, well, reading the end of your book again today, there were two things that kind of annoyed me, and I think this has to do with these issues about the sort of diversity of views being widely represented in sort of academic communities. One of them, and both of them, were issues basically about sort of economic and redistributive policy. One was your perplexity about opposition to the status quo social security system, and the other was your perplexity about or your skepticism of the idea that high marginal tax rates can sort of reduce economic efficiency and innovation and so forth. And I don't bring it up because I want to argue it here. Because we're out of time. But I bring it up because there's just a whole suite of arguments that are out there about these topics. That I just don't think that I don't think most academics who say aren't professional policy analysts or who aren't economists just won't be aware of because they're just not part of your everyday political conversation. So, I wrote a long paper on why liberals ought to support, Social Security privatization. I'd love to hear what you have to think about it. But because I always identify as a liberal, like when we talk about sort of these questions about cosmopolitanism and tolerance and immigration, whatever these issues are, I am like basically a 110 proof liberal. But then I just get sort of perplexed when the topic turns to questions about economic and social policy, where there are just real empirical questions about what policies will have what effect. And what I would like to see is sort of classical liberals like myself and more traditional liberals just having a more sane discussion about the sort of empirical dimensions of the practical dimensions of policies that would bring about generally liberal ends and that represent liberal values.
Okay.
So that's my plea.
Yeah, the epilogue was written right after the elections of 2004. Is very much on the defensive, and I think I replied to Tyler Cullen's blog review of the book. By saying, when we get to the question of marginal tax rates, he didn't bring up Social Security, although he scoffed at my idea that conservatives hate it. And I said, actually, historically, it's not been too popular. But no, I admit when I deal with the marginal tax rates, my perplexity is, I said my original line was, "Damn it, Jim, I'm a literature professor, not a tax analyst." But my editor struck the first two words. And so my admission of incompetence is still there in the text.
Yeah.
But I mean, for me, this raises, even if we have a point of disagreement about this, and even if you're vastly better informed about the economic consequences of tax policies than I am, there's whole areas where I no longer really know reliably day to day how libertarian I am. It starts with recognizing that the state has no real compelling interest in mandating heterosexuality. It goes to reproductive rights. And then, as I mentioned in my email to you, when you factor in disability, on the one hand, if you're like me, you want a strong welfare state with regard to disability, but you don't want a paternalist state. You don't want people housed in institutions, and you want to give people with disabilities greater autonomy, which is really interesting. That's why the ADA passed with such bipartisan support. And, Democrats thought, great, this strengthens the welfare state. Republicans said, great, it makes people more independent of government. And as I admitted to you, with certain things, ranging from gambling to motorcycle helmet wearing, I'm not really sure any longer what I think about to what extent the left should be, or for that matter, I should be libertarian as well as liberal. But yeah, no, like I said, when it comes to economic policy, I've admitted for some time now, I'm on the wing of the academic left that knows that neoliberalism is bad and global capitalism is bad, but is not really sure where the money for the department photocopier comes from. And that's not my line. It's Leroy Searle's line. He teaches at Washington, but I wish I had said it.
Well, I think we'll have to end there. We've gone a little bit over time. But, Michael, thanks for coming on. I've got a copy of your book that I'm holding up to the camera, What's Liberal About the Liberal Arts. Came out in 2006. The last chapter might seem, like
hardly relevant today.
Yeah, in another era, but I think the whole book is a wonderful discussion of what the politics of liberal arts education today. So thanks for coming on. It was a fascinating discussion, and sorry we couldn't get to more topics on our list.
Oh, no, thanks for having me. It was really enjoyable on my end. Thanks, Walt.
All right. Take care.
Likewise.